just working.
What's wrong? Oh. Okay, we got you, girl. You're just working. That's what you're saying. You're working all weekend. Okay.
Yeah, just working. So no, nothing fun.
Nothing fun. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start, you guys, and then Sherry and Jamie, whenever they're able to log in, well, they can catch up, or I'll post it for them. But tonight is kind of fun because I wanted to roll out to you guys. I'm always kind of teaching these different concepts, but I always breeze through the historical aspects. And so tonight I thought I would combine the two, go over a little bit of history, and then how we're kind of doing these things in today's day and age. So we're going to go over the traditional rites of witchcraft. I'm calling it witchcraft, but really any spiritual practice is a craft. This is just, an easy term for me to use. There are three main rituals. Today they have different names, but traditionally they're called the compass round, treading the mill, and the housel or the red meal. So I'm going to kind of explain what these are, where they were developed, where they came from, and how we do those now, and exactly how you guys can do them, whether you're a solitary or you work with a group or a coven. So I enjoy this kind of stuff because I think there's a lot to from it. So the first thing I wanted to kind of explain is what is traditional witchcraft. So traditional witchcraft, I like to say, is, I think I said it in my video, it's like this giant tree with many branches and many roots because it pulls from so many different sources. So some of the sources traditional witchcraft does pull from is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Graves. Graves wrote a book called The White Goddess, otherwise known in today's day and age of as Hecate, or the divine mother maiden crone, which I'll explain when I get into the people part of the lesson tonight. But it also pulls from the Key of Solomon, which I'll also touch on for those of you that aren't familiar. The witch trial transcripts, and a lot of grimoires referencing ceremonial magic, and especially Welsh ceremonial magic, very folkloric magic. So these are the main areas traditional witchcraft and practices pulled from. And so I'm going to kind of break these down a little bit for you guys. So the Key of Solomon, I think that is something most practitioners are familiar with. The Key of Solomon, I'm actually in December doing a presentation called Banned from the Bible. And I'm going to be reviewing some of the books that were banned and why, like because there was divination in them, or people going to witch healers. But also, the Book of Psalms is it's basically a book of spells. King David, King Solomon, they all had occult ties, and so it's kind of interesting that that's been kind of hushed over the years. But the Key of Solomon, this is the same Solomon that partook in writing the Book of Psalms, had a collection of grimoires or magical texts. And there's two different forms of this, the lesser key and the greater key. And these books basically described what we refer to as demons or shadow deities, shadow elementals, their sigils and symbols, the rituals to sort of summon and awaken them. He even had incantations for controlling those entities. So it pulls from that. It's probably the most well known aspect of traditional witchcraft. Robert Graves. So, as I was saying earlier, it pulls from Graves, The White Goddess. So, this was a book that he wrote referencing the triple goddess who had associations to the moon, nature, fertility. She was kind of like that archetype that was depicted as the maiden mother crone. So, if for those of you that aren't familiar, if you're ever looking at witchcraft art, when you see the elder with the midlife with the young, that's your mother maiden crone association. So the moon nature poetry, later on down the years, we did start associating the white goddess to Hecate, or however you want to pronounce it. I pronounce it as Hecate, the Greek goddess, associated with the crossroads, magic, the night, very much linked to witchcraft. She's sort of considered the goddess of witches. And then comes in Robert Cochrane. This is another name that a lot of people who practice are familiar with. Robert Cochrane, he committed suicide, I think, in 1966, and I'll break that down too. But he pulled a lot from Graves' work. When you look at traditional witchcraft, the traditional ceremonies, Cochrane, his name always comes up. So he used the white goddess as sort of a central figure in his practice that he developed. He kind of tweaked it. He, Cochrane was an interesting character. A lot of the traditional people were very interesting. He had her married to who is called the horned god, and that they had a child, the sun god child. So Cochrane took it a step further and kind of created a whole a storyline. Here's the thing. I work with deity, and everybody who works with deity is going to connect to this in a different way. I don't work with a horned god, but Cochrane, he did and believed that Hecate was the horned god's wife. So a lot of the ritual that was created back then that's still used today is based on that premise of the horned god, Hecate as the white goddess wife, and their horned child, the young sun god. So a little bit more about Robert Cochrane. He did commit suicide in 1966. He is a pioneer in witchcraft. The other name he goes by is Roy Bowers. That's his birth name. He claimed to be from a hereditary line of witches that was never substantiated, but he got those grimoires from somewhere. A very Welsh-based mythology, very medieval folk line and folklore association. A lot of his work, he created what was called Tubal Cain, which people refer to that as a cult. But it was gray magic, which I think all magic is gray. But his was gray in the sense that he liked to call it confusion magic. He was a very paranoid person, and he was always wanting his disciples to prove themselves, like prove that they were worthy and trustworthy. And so his type of gray magic, confusion magic, was to see who was who was, worthy of being in the circle and who wasn't. So the other thing with him too, the clan of Tubal Cain, that actually still exists today. Ever since his death, there's been a lot of branch offs, different neo-pagan and magical groups that have continued to teach the same things that he was teaching. Now, of course, every group is going to have, small deviations, but for the most part, the rituals are the same. Again, the pale-faced goddess known as Hecate, the horned god, and Fate, the child they had together. These are all still associations today. Now, there are more defined associations, like the horned god being associated with fire, the underworld, and time. Sometimes he's referenced as the goat god of fire, craft, and lower magics, and fertility and death as well, although that's much more white goddess affiliations. Some of the other names, besides the horned god, was Tubal Cain, Bron, Wayland. So they had the son I explained to you, the horned child, who was a young sun god. So this still exists today. It's been tweaked over the years, but this was kind of the foundation, like when witchcraft was kind of being birthed and accepted. So one other interesting thing I wanted to tell you about traditional witchcraft before we're jumping into ceremonial stuff is nursery rhymes. So I'm sure you guys over the years, a lot of our nursery rhymes are kind of dark. A lot of them are built around tragedies. I think what was the one? I'm trying to remember the nursery rhyme where we'd be on the playground, we would be dancing in a circle, it was ring around the rosy, pockets full of cozy, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. I think that was one of them that was kind of based on a real life, like somebody, I think there was like a fire and there was death. I don't know. But the point is, nursery rhymes have always served the place as ciphers. And so, especially in traditional witchcraft, that's how they would communicate with one another, is through nursery rhyme ciphers. The taper that lights the way is one of those. Google it. I didn't write it down in here. I didn't want to spend too much time in the nitty gritty, like kind of stuff. But a lot of the nursery rhymes in early traditional witchcraft, um, they did rhyme, number one, because they were using terminology and vocabulary that had a vibration and a frequency connected to what they were trying to manifest. They also wanted to be very secretive. It was accepted, but not fully accepted. So they had to kind of be careful. And there were recurring themes in those nursery rhymes as ciphers in witchcraft. And that was, they would reference numbers, like number one was the word fate. Number seven was like stars or kids. Three was mothers. Four was kings, directions. So it was really interesting. Like if you ever wanted to do a deep dive on that, how they use those kind of nursery rhyming ciphers to communicate. Now, the other thing with traditional witchcraft, besides the mythos aspect of it, is cosmological maps. So I'm going to talk about this a couple of times tonight. Cosmological maps were used for every single ritual. And I kind of have an example here on the screen, but it was basically a circle. We've talked about, I think our group Tuesday night, we talked about the sacred magical uses of a circle. It's like a contract. It also sets boundaries. And so it's basically a circle where they would note north, south, east, and west. And then they would do associations. So whatever ritual they were working on. So for example, if they were working on, say, maybe a darker ritual, and they were like maybe trying to bind somebody or bind a situation, they might associate north to cold or Odin, the east to Lucifer, the south to Dionysus, the west to King Arthur. So they would, each ritual was unique. So each of these directions would have an element that would be associated, an entity that would be associated, and oftentimes additional aspects to coordinate with the intent. But this is just an example of what a cosmological map would look like. Okay, so basic things. These traditional rites and rituals were expansive and inclusive, means that they were pushing energy out versus pulling it in. So these were rituals based on either, I would say, clearage of some sort or travel, meaning that and not necessarily astral travel, but spiritual travel in the effect that they were trying to create a ripple in what existed in our timeline, right? So all of these rituals involve casting a circle, which again, that's contracts, that's containment, that's creating boundaries, and that also establishes inwardness, right? All of these rituals I'm going to go over tonight involve a cauldron. So the cauldron in traditional witchcraft symbolized the goddess. It also symbolized our making amends, our cleansing of ourselves to go into the circle and to change energy, to manipulate energy. Every one of these rituals include willow wands, and each willow wand in traditional witchcraft was three cuts of willow, so three branches of willow tied together. And so each member would have one of these willow wands. It was considered a way to transmute energy. There were four really big, I would say, times of the year where these rituals were used. They were used all the time, but there was four big ones. And most people are familiar with Midsummer or not. Today, I am going to kind of discuss what Hogmanay and Candlemas is, but I have the big four on here. But nowadays, in today's day and age, the big four really isn't as prominent as it used to be. So people use these rituals for lots of different things. Each and every ritual started with a statement to release sin. So again, cleansing. To go into the sacred circle to cast, you needed to cleanse, to purge. So any kind of karmic debt you accumulated since the last ritual, you would need to shed. So there was this confession and purification process. And whoever was sort of leading that particular ritual, they would actually go around to the different members, and as they confessed their karmic debt, they would anoint them on the head. typically this leader, and sometimes some of the higher ups in the groups would wear, you guys probably have seen pictures online. It's like a leaf mask. This kind of was something meant for just the leader of a ritual. It wasn't really for everybody unless they were higher ups, because that individual was kind of set aside to be leading the prayers and petitions aspect of the ritual. They also did the blessing for the ritual. Now, EFT tapping. Now, people didn't call this EFT tapping back in the day, but they did EFT tapping, and I'll break that down when we jump into the rituals. It's very interesting. Sorry, I had to wet my whistle. Other things that were involved in all of these rituals, there was always incense, bell ringing. There was always a part of the ritual where they were paying homage to whatever deity, entity, god, deceased king that they were kind of soliciting during the ritual. Some of the other things that are universal amongst traditional witchcraft is it's called find the bridge. So find the bridge is the part of ritual where they were charging their cauldron or their pot. So this was when they were speaking intentions, doing their EFT tapping. That's not what it was called back then, but that's what it was. It was finding the bridge. Then it would go into fashioning the bridge. So when you hear people in traditional forms of witchcraft talking about fashioning the bridge, before they could start the ritual, they would have that cleansing, but they also had to renew their oath. They would have to renew their oath themselves, the other members of the group, if there were other members, and also to any deity that they were soliciting. Then the third part is called tipping the cauldron. So when you hear people talk about tipping the cauldron, that is when the participants in the ritual are entering that circle, they're entering that sacred ring. Basic things that you would find inside the circle, inside the ring. So typically there would always be a skull. Now, a skull actually represents wisdom in old ritual. When we're looking at the way things have been done for millennia, skulls always represented wisdom. You would find, of course, the cauldron. Usually each member would have a dagger. There would usually be a broom there inside the circle. A hexagram was very common. You'll see that in a lot of old texts. A sword. You would have the leader, who would be referred to as the green man, and then there could be sickles and staff in that circle as well. Other things that you're going to find is salt. There would be a bowl of salt. Salt represents, from a traditional witchcraft standpoint, life. It's life force. There would be a bowl of ash, ash representing the dead. So a lot of times there was solicitation of not just ancestors, but also transient spirit, any transient spirit that were in our plane that wanted to connect to us in ritual. There would be water. Water, of course, is considered a river to the other world, right? So water connects us to the divine. So there would always be water. And then there would be that, again, that skull for wisdom, but usually next to it would be a sword. And the reason that they would do this in the traditional rituals is because, again, when you look at Cochrane, there was, a little bit of paranoia. It was to represent truth, that everybody was there for the right reasons, that they were trustworthy, that they were loyal, devoted to each other. So it was a symbolism of truth, almost a scary kind of indirect threatening symbolism, but that's what it was. And then there was usually in the very beginning what was called the cauldron of inspiration. So that is part of charging the pot or finding the bridge. So usually at that part, so knives are a representative of intellect when they're entered into the water mix inside the cauldron. So participants, when they were finding the bridge, charging the pot, would do the cauldron of inspiration. They would dance around the cauldron 9 times, plunging their little knives into it 5 times. Then the leader, the green man in the leaf mask, he would take an empty grail, dip it in the cauldron, and everybody drank from it. It was usually like a water wine mix that was heated in the cauldron. Again, this was to unite and bond them energetically so that all of them were working together to manifest. Words were pretty minimal at this stage. It was kind of like more free flow. So whoever was in charge, the green man, we'll call him, he was pretty much the only one that would be speaking. Now, before I get too much into the other stuff, I always try to remind myself to not get too far ahead and then have to go too far back. So the two traditional holidays that these traditional rites are used for, the first one is called Hogmanay. Hogmanay is a Scottish New Year's celebration, New Year's Eve. This was aligned with witchcraft because the focus of this particular celebration was new beginnings, cleansing, and warding off of bad luck. So Hogmanay celebrations, many traditional crafts, they would have these big rituals. So it was a time for reflection, setting intentions, using spells to do that. So what Hogmanay is kind of like a spell casting holiday in Scotland. It is also a time where participants reflect on the past year, release anything negative from it, and just focus on the future. There is a tradition called first footing. So, first footing is where your very first visitor after midnight brings a gift. And usually that gift is something like salt, coal, shortbread, something that represents cleansing and good luck to the household. There was usually fire rituals also after, any sort of like treading the mill ritual. The fire ritual was the symbolic burning of objects, usually from the previous year, to kind of establish that release. Also to ward off evil spirits or entities and to purify oneself. So, very similar. Hogmanay is almost like a witch's holiday, but not exactly. It does use all the same elements. It is very ritualized, and that's why, treading the mill and the red meal became so popular at these times of the year. I like the first footer. I think I wish we did that. Like I like the idea of first footing, like going from house to house after midnight on New Year's Eve and bringing gifts. Because it was a lot of good cheer. It was warmth. It was, prosperity boost. And I just think it's a very nice way to connect to people. But that was the first one I wanted to talk about. I won't go on too much about it. The second one is Candlemas. A lot of people confuse Candlemas with Christmas. Um, Candlemas is actually observed on February 2nd. Now, there is a Christian holiday at that same time. So this is like Mary's purification. However, in paganism, we recognize this as in both, right? So it's the midpoint between winter solstice and spring equinox. So in all these different traditions, Christian, Wiccan, pagan, their February 2nd is a kind of a big time of the year for everybody. So a lot of traditional witchcraft practices did involve the February 2nd Candlemas. There nowadays it's very Bridget focused. There's a lot of Bridget work around this time of year, even with traditional witchcraft practitioners. It's just kind of changed over the years. But again, it's purifying, it's cleansing, it's new beginnings. Um, it's that halfway point. So a lot of your traditional pagans, they'll light candles, they'll have bonfires, they're honoring the sun. The Candlemas orientation, from a Christian point of view, right, is the presentation of Jesus and Mary's purification 40 days after Christmas. So it's also known as the Feast of the Presentation of Jesus, and it has all these different names. So they all kind of happen at the same time. So it's very interesting how you find these overlays with witchcraft and Christianity and other forms of paganism. They all kind of interconnect, but we just kind of celebrate them a little bit differently. Pagans, they usually create altars. They have the fresh herbs and sprouts. Again, there's usually Bridget's cross made out of straw or wheat. And their ritual really is about spiritual cleansing. Christians, they do their candle processions and blessings. There is like some folklore that suggests that the weather on Candlemas Day can predict the length of winter. So kind of like our Groundhog Day, right? We do Groundhog Day at the same time, which is funny when you look at these correlations. So this is one of the great Sabbaths, right? It's a great Sabbath because it crosses many thresholds of spiritual belief systems and many different rituals. But tonight we're focusing on traditional ritual, traditional witchcraft. So that's why I'm bringing it up. All right, EFT tapping. So in treading the mill, which is one of the three rituals I'm going to review with you tonight, they didn't call it EFT tapping back in the day, but we know today that's exactly what it is. As they were treading the mill, they would tap each other and touch each other on these special activation points. So, depending on what the ritual was, say they were doing a prosperity ritual, maybe somebody in their coven needed a loan from the bank to open a business. They may, at that point, do EFT tapping on the chin, on the top of the head. These are activation points for money acquisition. So it's very interesting. I don't know how much you guys know about EFT tapping, but the EFT tapping structure from treading the mill back 100 years ago and what we do today is almost exactly the same, which is why I bring it up. They're using the same activation points in the ritual as they did 100 plus years ago. So there is something to that. There is something to those activation strikes when you're doing rituals. So I wanted to definitely present that to you guys because I think it's important. The other thing that I think is important to understand about traditional witchcraft is the standpoint of, and I always have a hard time pronouncing this word, and it's Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is not witchcraft, right? However, they they are almost a cult like. It's two very distinct systems of belief and practice. However, the two are very closely intertwined. So Gnosticism is rooted in ancient, religious and philosophical movements. Really the core of Gnosticism is liberation from the material world, right? So it is, the material world and material physical things in it are flawed, evil, and we need to liberate ourselves from that. We need to transcend that. We need to evolve past the need for that in our lives. Because the more that we give into that, the more we allow evil in, right? So that's kind of like their standpoint. Now, in witchcraft, especially traditional witchcraft, we're kind of the same way, but we're very ritualized and we try to connect with nature. We don't really demonize the physical, like material aspects necessarily. We try to heighten our connection to nature. So it's interesting because there is some overlay overlay there. So in Gnosticism, salvation comes through acquiring secret knowledge about the true nature of reality and one's own divine self or force. They believe in a dualistic universe where the material world is separate from and inferior to the spiritual realm. Well, that sounds a lot like witchcraft, right? So Gnostic systems do recognize a creator god or divine source. Depending on the text, it may have a couple different names. It's a transcendent god responsible for creating the flawed material world. So it's almost like a shadow god, I guess is a good way to describe it. More of that shadow energy. So there are beings in Gnosticism, they consider them either angelic or demonic, associated with the material world. And they exist to create obstacles for us and our spiritual liberation. So again, lots of overlay. If you look at traditional witchcraft, a lot of this, we use different terms. We may explain things a little differently, but it's kind of the same thing. So again, and Gnostics believe that, there is that transcendent ability in all of us, to become divine. And in witchcraft, we encompass a wide range of practices, whether it's Wicca, folk magic, other paganism, but we're kind of working towards the same thing. Manipulating energy to lift frequency, lift vibration. We emphasize that connection to nature and the cycles of the earth. We use different techniques to get on the same vibration as those things so we can influence them or gain knowledge. We work with deities, spirits, other beings, drawing upon ancient tradition. Gnostics do as well. Their rituals aren't called spells, but they are rituals. So the reason I want I wanted to present this to you is not to confuse you, but in Gnosticism, there's a lot of overlay with traditional witchcraft. And if you start studying it and you start studying the rituals, it can be confusing if you don't know. um, but there is in both studies like that hidden or esoteric knowledge and practice. So, coming out of that Gnosticism, there is another figure I wanted to present to you, and that is Crowley. A lot of you guys probably have heard of him. He was a prominent occultist. He was associated with not just Gnosticism, but also ceremonial magic. So he walked both sides of the road. He walked right down the middle of the road with a foot in each lane. Definitely, he was a witch for sure. This is him right here. So he was English. He was also a poet, a novelist, a mountaineer, a painter. He founded a religion called Thelema. I'm not very familiar with it. I haven't studied that, so I didn't want to jump into it too much. But he was known for quotes. Like one of his favorite quotes was, "One would go mad if one took the Bible seriously, but to take it seriously, one must be already mad." So he always had these one liners, right? And so this religion he founded, it was based on the Kabbalah. It was kind of a spiritual and social philosophy that he kind of spent his whole life kind of defining and growing. Um, he thought it was bigger than philosophy or religion because the central premise of the Thelema is that one is going to do what one wants and that people should set their own moral codes. Well, that's a lot like traditional witchcraft. That's pretty much like the catchphrase for that handbook. So he's another pioneer. He's considered one of the pioneers besides Cochrane and Graves in traditional witchcraft as we know it. So if you ever study this, you're going to see this guy, Crowley, and those two other gentlemen. All right. The other aspect that traditional witchcraft is built on, surprisingly, is 17th century sin eating. So when people think of sin eaters, a lot of times their mind automatically goes to native culture. In a lot of Native American tribes, there were sin eaters. This is actually sin eating that took place in England and Wales. Starting back in the 17th century. Again, grimoires. When Cochrane was building Tubal Cain, he was using these grimoires. And so all the rituals were in there. So these were rituals being used back in the 17th century. Anyways, a sin eater was believed to be able to consume through ritual the sins of the deceased, transferring them from that soul to themselves. So, again, transmutation. We talked about one of the many things that is required in these rituals is those willow wands because it's able to transmute. And so, this is another one of those transmutation things that have carried on over the years. The reason a sin eater would do that is to prevent the deceased from experiencing spiritual torment after death. And then the sin eater would typically consume bread or other food, and that's another ritual that we're going to review tonight, the red meal or the housu. Um, he would consume that food off the corpse. I know that sounds kind of morbid, but there's a lot of, I can tell you stories. But anyway, don't let me get sidetracked. Getting back on track here, when they would eat the food off the corpse, they were kind of eating the sins of that deceased. These individuals were usually considered lower individuals in society. Maybe they were poor, maybe they were from a poor family. So they were very marginalized, they were very ostracized. People looked at them as having contaminated their own souls. But we know now that these were healers, right? But back then people didn't look at things the way that we can kind of see them now. So the sin eater, they would do this. They, like I said, they were usually a lower social class. They were shunned and feared by the community. These rituals were to absolve the deceased sins, allowing their soul to pass into the afterlife without spiritual impediment. So this is very prominent in Wales and the borderlands between England and Wales, and really all over the world. But that's where we have some of in witchcraft, again, this is where we have a lot of grimoires is from this time period. And in those grimoires, they do talk about the sin eaters. And that's why it was maintained for all these years, why it's still part of that practice. So it did fade out of practice, in England, I forget which century, but Usually after the sin eater did their job, quote unquote, they were given like another piece of bread, a coin, maybe a drink. Um, so, like the sin eater, it's kind of a weird thing because they took on those sins. And I'm not really sure when you look at the magical grimoires and the ceremonial texts, it doesn't really tell you what happened to these sin eaters. Like, you don't hear about them dying, you don't hear about them, anything bad happening to them. But if they were going around eating sin, I mean, they must have been transmuting that energy somehow. So I believe they transmuted that energy through what's called the household or the red meal, which is one of the rituals I'm teaching you guys tonight. All right. Are you guys all with me? Are we good so far? Am I going too fast or do I need to like explain anything more? You guys are good? Okay.
Good.
Awesome. All right. So mythos equals tradition. Now, one of the other these are all like little factoids. I wanted to make sure I gave you guys all the correct information. So there is usually three herbs put in the cauldron, depending on the intent, depending on the ritual. But those three herbs represent what we call the three mothers. Okay, so that is I'm a mugwort fanatic, right? But I don't think they were using mugwort. I'd like to say they were using mugwort, but they weren't. Hyssop, is probably one of the herbs they were using. But it was to increase the vibration and frequency with the participants to be of that mothering status, which was an elevated status, right? The ring, the circle, we talked about sacred circles Tuesday night. We're talking about it again tonight. That was considered, I want you guys to think of a car. So the circle is the car. So when you're doing a ritual, when I'm explaining these rituals to you, when I talk about the circle, casting the circle, anything with the circle, I want you to think of a car. Where cars are for travel, right? The cauldron is in the middle of the circle. That is the gas. That is the fuel. That is what fuels the car. It's the gas in the tank. The circle is the car. The cauldron is the gas in the tank. Now, casting of the cauldron on the circle when they're taking liquid out, the gas out, and they're splashing it onto the car. And they didn't really splash it. They poured it from that special, chalice or cup that they all drank from. They would do this at the north gate only, by the way. That's how they started the car. They would cast the cauldron juice at the north gate, the north point of the circle. That I want you to visualize as getting into the car. So you got the car, you put the gas in the car, you cast the circle, and now you're getting into the car. Now, at that point, usually the cauldron is kicked over by the leader, right? This is usually the green man, the leaf mask man, whoever is leading that ritual. And that is going to be kicked to the north because what's going to happen is liquid is going to fill that ring. That's called tipping. And I'll send this to you guys, but if you go back, we talked about, finding blah, blah, blah. This is tipping the cauldron. This is the tipping the cauldron step. So now in the center of the ring, that main person, the green man who is running the ritual, he is going to close from anybody. He closes it, which means nobody else can enter it. At that point, whoever's going to be in this is in that circle. Nobody else can come in. That was symbolized by closing it by banging 3 times on the ground, and all the participants would bow 3 times. As they entered, they carried a lit candle often into that circle with them. So that was indicating that they tipped the cauldron and now they're closing the circle to start that ritual. Nobody else can come into that circle. It's sacred. Like there cannot be any deviation from that. I actually think there are some grimoires, there's some magical texts out there where things happened and the circles were violated. Like people tried entering or leaving and it was not good for those people. So like the other members like oftentimes attacked them because they felt like they were attracting something really horrible by doing that. Anyway, I'm off course again. All right, so now I want you also in your mind, this circle that they were using, they usually made a little moat. So like if it was outside, usually in the woods, whatever, they would, dig kind of like a moat. That circle had like a little moat to it, a little divot. It had like an imprint so that when they cast the circle, when they kicked the cauldron, that water would go in there. The only problem with this is when I was, researching this, you have to create some sort of pivot point. So you would actually probably have to have a moat, from the center going to the outer ring to fill that ring. And you would probably need to create an angle. So you would have to create maybe like a mound of dirt or something to get that going. So it takes a little prep. When you read the magical text, if you guys ever study this, they don't talk a lot about that, but I've done some of this stuff, and I can tell you right now, you need to build a makeshift mound to create a pivot point to actually fill a moat circle. It's not just going to fill it because you tip the cauldron. You need to give it angle, and you need to give it, the ability to do that. Anyway, moving on. So the middle of the circle also at this time is where they might place an object to represent the ritual purpose. Again, the example I used earlier, say it's, one of the group members are applying for a loan from a bank to start a business. They may put the loan papers in there or a picture of the loan agent or the bank or bank dirt or something to symbolize what they're working on that night. So there is going to be a part here, as I was saying, they're going to have the herbs, the water, the wine, all this stuff going in the cauldron. They're also stirring intent into that cauldron. So usually in the text, the main person running the ritual, the green man, is the one doing that. However, there are other rituals in other grimoires, like where other people are doing it. So I think you could do it either way. I don't think it has to be just the one person or the leader. So compass, let's talk about compasses before we jump into the very first ritual. So I want you to think of a compass when I talk about the compass ritual as an access point. It is a map. It is created for containment and to really kind of wash out our sins so that we're cleansed from karmic debt from what we're doing. It's also consider it like a transport, like a compass in this sense is like a transport map, treading the mill. When we talk about treading the mill, I want you to think about evocation, like you're evoking energies and deity. You're connecting to spirit. This is the connection point, the connection ritual. And when I talk about treading the mill, there is a lot of rhythmic pacing around that central point. And as I'm talking about that, I want you to visualize it's usually a slow, steady pace. The participants sometimes chant, not always. It can be sped up, it can go counterclockwise, depending again on your intent. But I want you to visualize as I explain it, kind of like that slower, steady pace. And when we talk about dancing, I told you earlier that they would dance that 9 times around and then dip their little knives in it 5 times. They would always dance in the treading the mill ritual from traditional perspective, facing outward. Now, nowadays, people will face each other or they'll face inward. But back in the day, 100 plus years ago, that was a big no-no. You always wanted to be facing outward. You wanted your back to the belief was back then the reason you had your back to the cauldron, the center, is because your deity, your spirit, your transient spirit would manifest there, and you didn't really want to make eye contact. That wasn't always the case, but that is why it was the way it was back in the old texts. All right. All right, the compass round. This is the first ritual. I know I've rambled on here for a minute, but here it finally is, you guys. This is the first of 3. Hang on. All right, so the compass round. This is that first of 3 rituals that have that traditional meat, that spice to it. This is also known as the witch's compass. I kind of put an example here, and I kind of briefly talked about this earlier tonight. But this is a traditional witchcraft ritual that uses a circular framework. The circle is magic. We did that thing Tuesday night. I can't stress enough that circles are magic. Whatever you put into it, even if you're drawing a circle and you're putting a picture or an image or a sigil in there, you are creating energy, right? So the circle is energy. Now, with the witch's compass ritual, you're doing a cosmological map. You are creating something that represents the 4 directions, right? The 4 elements and your connection to them. So it's not just a tool for protecting or raising power, but it is a map and method for revelation, divination, and manifesting intention. So this ritual does involve creating liminal space. Now, we talk about liminal space in these groups We usually talk about that in the context of dream work. When we talk about Asclepian snake dream healing or ancestral or visitation dreaming, we talk about that liminal space, how we can access it. This ritual, from a traditional witchcraft point of view, is the same thing, but you're doing it from a conscious, awake level. But you are creating that liminal space, same as in your dream work. So you're envisioning connections to the directions. You're envisioning your not just the directions, but the elements that are represented there, the deity that maybe you've assigned there. Remember earlier I said you're assigning the directions, and you're also assigning, the earth elements and the deital elements to them. So you're kind of envisioning all of that and your spirit connecting to them. All right. So sometimes participants would enter a trance-like state to connect with these energies of the compass. Now, this framework, often was visualized as a circle divided into four quadrants, representing, again, the north, south, east, west. This is a map of the cosmos and a tool for working with the energies. They called it the energies of the winds or the energies of spirit. So when you're trying to manifest something, you need to tap into the right frequency and vibration. That's what this compass says. You need to tap into which one of these directions is in line with the frequency you're trying to get things lifted or lowered to, what element, what deity. So you're making this map, right? And what you need to tap into to manifest what you want. Creating the compass. This can involve physically drawing a circle on the ground, or solitary practitioners, especially nowadays, visualize it in their mind. So it's whatever works best for you. Liminal space. The compass round creates a sacred space. It's a threshold between worlds, right? Where a practitioner can access different realms and energies. So those of you that do dream work, it's the same concept. You're creating that gateway environments, that parallel sort of plane of existence that you can kind of access, almost like the Akashic records, but a little bit different. Connections to the directions. Practitioners often visualize glowing lines or pathways connecting them to each of the four directions, enhancing that connection then to the energies of each cardinal point. So there's a little bit of astrology here too. I wanted to really dive deep into the astrology part, but I'm not going to do that. I don't want to confuse anybody. And in the traditional grimoires, the traditional witchcraft, they did not really acknowledge astrology. But nowadays, we know there's a lot of astrological correspondence here. But anyways, moving forward. Trance and chanting. Some traditions involve entering that trance-like state, potentially through chanting, to deepen the connection with the compass and its energies. Quick, little trick for you guys. If you're solitary and you're trying to create liminal space, that can be difficult to do. I think it's easier to do in a group because you have everybody focusing on something and you're all opening something together, a portal. When you're on your own, invasive thoughts, distractions, it's harder to create liminal space. There is a cheat to that. And I think I've talked to you about it before, Lisa. I call it mind machines. There was a great one on the market years ago called the Luma 10. The one I use now is called the Casina. These are actually, they're goggles and earbuds or headphones that use binaural beats and flashing LEDs to shift your brain's basically the level it's functioning at, the frequency and vibration of your brain activity. You can use one of those machines to help you create a liminal space. Again, like I said, I love the Luma 10. Right now I'm using the Casina. I think, Lisa, you've used the David Pal, or you were talking about using the David Pal. There's a lot of them out there. It's just a tool to help us. They had distractions back then 100 years ago, but I think now, like, there is so much more around us happening all the time. There's so much more to get distracted about. I think it's prolifically harder to access liminal space when you're conscious nowadays versus how it was 100 years ago. So anything to help that process, definitely use. There's nothing wrong with using tools or gadgets to get you there. Anyway, I went off on a tangent again, damn it. All right, purpose. The compass round can be used for divination. It can be used for spirit work, even spirit communication work. I would not suggest using a compass round ritual for a seance or like a group. If you're doing it for spirit work, I would probably do it solo. It can be used for practical sorcery. So this is your practical manifestation works, puppetry, um, radionics, even like, all of these different things. You can use the compass round in as part of your casting. It is a ritual of itself, of its own. As a matter of fact, I wanted to show you guys. I'm going to see if my secondary camera here will work. Let's see. I actually have a compass round carpet. Now, those of you that are very good at making things, you could probably make one of these. Or there are some really great people on Etsy that make these also. But I want to show you mine. Whoops, I don't want to go forward. Hang on. Um, Here, let me do this real quick and then I'll pull it back up. Oh, there it is. So, just to give you an idea of what you could use, let's see. Boy, I am not techie and I'm like playing around. Let's see. Oh, there it is. This is my compass round carpet. Oh gosh, you can barely see it because I have stuff all over. So basically, you can use sigils. Oh my gosh. I cannot control. Okay, there. I moved my hand a little bit and it does all this. Okay, hang on. Let me try from over here. All right, that's better. You can't see all of it, but okay, you can use sigils, use your directions. So right now I don't have it activated, so I have like north facing like west. Like I don't have it like lined up the way I would line it up if I was actually using it. But you can use a carpet. Like you can use anything for that compass round. Hang on. Let's go back. You guys, I'm not good with tech, but I did want to try to show I wanted to try to show you. Okay. Um Let me go back to look, I pushed a bunch of buttons now, but my whole point was you can use anything. Why am I getting this? Are you kidding me? How do you make this go away? There we go. You can use anything for a compass round. Like if you have like that carpet, I put that carpet under my computer chair when I'm casting at the altar sometimes for certain works. So for you guys, I mean, you can use it for whatever works for you. If you're using it for divination, if you're using a compass round for spirit work, whatever works for you. It's just, I like doing this, but everybody's different. And it is ritualized. It is a ritual of its own when you're using a witch's compass and a compass round. So that was the first ritual. The second ritual is treading the mill. This is a very movement based ritual. So it's a form of movement to raise power. Sometimes you'll hear in old texts, if you're studying old texts, it'll say approaching or greeting the altar. That's also treading the mill. Just it's a different name for it, greeting the altar, approaching the altar. So usually treading the mill is done in a group. The participants would be in that circle. They would have gone through the pre-circle thing and they would have entered the circle. They would have closed the circle. They would have tipped the cauldron and now they're treading the mill. And how it would work is typically you would have one hand, your right hand on the shoulder of the person in front of you as you walked around in a slow, steady pace, typically, not always, but that was typically how they did it. Treading the mill, treading the cauldron, right? You're building power physically. Now, in a lot of the old texts, the mill can be danced to. There's all sorts of things you can do here, but this was what was traditional and typical back then. The more you moved with your group around that circle, they oftentimes in the old texts refer to it as feeling like you were hooked up to like an old fashioned millstone, like you were like a cow or something. Like it became harder, almost like you were walking against a swift current because of the energy that you were building. So as the energy grew and the energy got stronger and that frequency got higher, you could literally feel physically in your body the tension of keeping up that momentum and that movement. But that was a good thing. That's what they looked for. As that happened in these rituals, they knew they were manifesting. They knew they were manifesting that intent because they could feel it in their bodies because it was harder to tread the mill. So during treading the mill, it can be very helpful to sing or chant together, of course, to try to keep rhythm, especially with the walking. Back then, I think they were much more coordinated. I think nowadays we've lost a little bit of our coordination ability. It is harder to tread the mill with, even if there's only, maybe six of you or whatever. If you're, or not even, if you have a very small group and you have a very small circle you cast, maybe you have a tiny cauldron going in there. Um, it can be difficult to keep rhythm. So sometimes chants and songs help with that. And so I did give you guys two of them. These are two popular ones from like 100 years ago, The Mill of Magic and The Power of the Elements. Now, when they wrote these back in the day, it does sound like a weird kind of Disney, evil villain kind of rhyme. But what they were looking to do is create something easy to memorize, something where the words vibrated at a very specific frequency and could also rhyme. So think of how complex that is. You're trying to choose vocabulary that's easily memorizable. You're trying to use vocabulary that's in line with the with the frequency and vibration you're trying to create. You're trying to do all these things. So they may look simple, they may look kind of silly, but they were hard to write because they had to check all these different boxes. So these are the two most famous ones. If you guys want them, I can definitely email this to you. Don't worry, or take a picture of your screen, whatever works best for you. But these are, you see these over and over again in all of the old ceremonial texts. So these were very popular. I think people still use these today. They may have tweaked them a little bit, but they're still used. So that is treading the mill. Treading the mill can be for anything. Again, let's use the guy who is going to the bank for a loan as an example. We've done all these like precast things. We're in the circle. We're treading the mill. The bank agent and the loan papers are in the middle there. And we are marching, keeping rhythm, building energy to manifest this thing. At some point, the leader, the green man, is going to end the ritual, by banging his stave on the ground 3 times. But he's not going to end it until he feels and recognizes that all the energy needed to be released has been released, right? So they may be treading that mill for 5 minutes. They may be treading that mill for, an hour. So the leader would be the determining factor of when enough energy has been culminated and then released for successful manifestation. The household, the third ritual I wanted to teach you guys tonight. Now, this has many, many different names. The Eucharist, it's the red meal. There is a very similar tradition, which is the dumb supper, only that focuses on death, or the dead, I should say. The household ritual, this is an offering ritual from you, the crafter, to the spirits that are helping you. Okay, so it's also kind of like a community, like trust building type ritual, but originally it was really just an offering. So the Christian Eucharist ceremony is very similar to this. Ritual feasting has always been an integral part of every society for forever. But it is especially attached to the Witches' Sabbath and Christian Eucharist ceremonies. So the witches of Salem were accused to have dined upon red wine and red bread when they would meet with the devil. And that is how it got the nickname the Red Meal. So just kind of a little FYI factoid there for you. So at its core, when we talk about the household and traditional witchcraft, we're talking about a ritualistic feast. So it gives you a chance to kind of commune and give thanks at the same time. It also is a way to receive divine messaging and build with our coven or our group. So, I mean, it can be done solitary, but usually it's done as a group. I mean, whatever works for you, though. It does strengthen bonds that you're forming, though, especially if you're new, you're like working with new practitioners. Um, it does grow whatever intent you're working on. So with the household, sometimes you can bring an intent to the table. I do consumption magic. This is a little bit off topic, but when I've done dumb suppers or red meals, I always incorporate a consumption manifestation point. So I'm baking sigils and symbols into the bread. I'm using dissolvable sigils and symbols for the beverages. And they're usually focused on very specific petitions, whether it's love acquisition, money acquisition, healing, protection. I think if you're going to do a household or a red meal, you might as well incorporate that because there is going to be spirit and deityl presence there. So why wouldn't you, right? I would take advantage of that frequency and vibration. Now, in the original text 100 years ago, they weren't doing that, but we know to do that now. So, you get what you give, right? This is kind of like one of those, like with offerings across the board. When we do work and we ask the universe to give us something, you get what you give. So you can't just be like, "Hey, give me I need $1,000 Friday," right? And then you walk away and whatever, right? You have to show gratitude. You have to be humble. And by doing these like households or red meals, that is our way to say, I am grateful and I am humble. And, I appreciate everything, every gift that's given to me. So you get what you give, right? The redness of the meal comes from it being symbolic of both sacrifice. It also alludes to the blood and bone aspect of offering. I mean, obviously, back in the day, they did use blood and bone, and even today, and Kathmandu, Nepal, they still slaughter oxen right there in the town square to, the living deity. It's one of the only places in the world that still has a living deity that they worship. So, I mean, they still do that in some places of the world, but not here. You'd probably get arrested. They'd make up a law that you violated and throw you in jail. Anyway, so there's a lot of lore on offerings. It could be very basic items like, breads, wine, fruit. But I would always encourage you, if you're going to do this ritual, if you're going to do a red meal or a hustle, I would really think about what you want to make and make it symbolic. So if you're thanking an ancestor, a transient spirit, a deity, any kind of certain directional energy, I reference the witch father and witch mother, divine source, divine mother. Make it personal, especially with ancestor, like that's more dumb supper stuff, but you always want to kind of like maybe make that person's favorite dish and put it in the middle of the table, right? If you're doing a deity like Aphrodite, and just for example, apples, you're going to want to use apples. Lilith, you're going to want to use apples, so, try to personalize it a little bit. Um, so again, red color, that symbolizes blood, life force, passion, strength, sacrifice, and this is used across all sorts of pagan and magical practices. It's also referenced as the witch's Eucharist. So, but in traditional texts, if you go back and look at the old grimoires, it's always referenced as the household. Nowadays, they give it these different names. So when is this is popular all the time, but there are standout periods that you might want to do this. At communions, like if you have new members into your group, Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is one of the witches' red meal times. So usually, like there will be a red meal amongst witches at Thanksgiving time. Anytime there's a celebration, somebody's getting married, funerals, somebody just died, you just, said goodbye. Now you're, instead of having, you're having a red meal for that person. There's all these different celebrations that can incorporate the red meal. Again, always think bread and wine. One of the things I would tell you is in the old texts, they would always do this at nighttime, and they would try to coordinate it with a full moon. And what they would do is they would actually set up a mirror to reflect the full moon through the window into their wine, which usually was in a cauldron or something. So this was a way to actually pull transmuted energy from the full moon, kind of infuse it. So it's kind of like consumption spell work, a little bit different than what we do now. But back in the day, I guess we would call it consumption spell work. They were infusing that culminating energy into the wine to kind of transmute, power themselves up, like drinking a it's like drinking a glass of wine with 9 volts in it, 9 volt batteries or something, right? um again, honor the blood and bone of ancestors. There is a custom of dipping bread in wine that's always talked about in the old ceremonial texts. It's like an old world custom, I guess, that built trust. So when you're reading the text, it's kind of hard to, were they dipping bread and then feeding it to each other in the wine? I'm not really sure, but there's something with that where it built trust amongst them. So maybe it was ritualized, but they didn't just write about it a whole lot. But there is that aspect that I've seen several times. All right. So in a nutshell, guys, that is the traditional rites of witchcraft. Hang on, let me hit buttons here. All right, questions, thoughts. feedback. What do you guys got anything for me at all? I'm here for it. Was it too much? Was it not enough?
It was good. I'm just trying to digest it all. It's a lot of information.